Where am I going here? Are we set? Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce this evening's keynote by Alice Bucknell, which is organized in conjunction with the master class that Alice is partaking over this fortnight, entitled Ways of Worlding. Alice is a North American writer and artist who works, well, let's say with she basically studied or has experience in anthropology and architecture. Her work focuses on the intersections of ecology, machine intelligence, architecture, through the use of game engines and speculative fiction strategies. It's a pleasure to have her here, well, not only with us for the coming 2 weeks, but also for our online audiences to introduce her work to us. So, at any rate, the orange podium is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Solomon. And thank you, and also to Juan, for inviting me here for the next 7 days, I think. 8 days, technically. It's really a pleasure to be here. The masterclass has really gotten off to a flying start so far. We're currently engaging in systems scale thinking, and we'll soon be moving on to landscape and monster. The final exhibition event is happening next Friday, so I hope some of you can make it, and I hope to see you there. To introduce my work tonight, I have around an hour, and I will be showing you a selection of video excerpts from ongoing projects of mine and recent work spanning 2020 to the present. And I typically tend to do my lectures and presentations in a quite discombobulating software called PureRef. A lot of my work deals with non-linearity, thinking through different scales and frameworks of time, understanding ways in which the deep past circles back to impact the near future, and vice versa. And I find a real home in the chaos energy, let's say, of PureRef, as it is basically just a canvas for arranging and thinking through thematics and questions key to my practice. I really do not enjoy the linearity of PowerPoint presentations, so this presentation strategy is kind of a exercise to work against that in both how I frame my work and how I talk about it. So let's go ahead and begin. I like to begin my talks with a list of references. This section of my PureRef document is essentially an ongoing library of research material, resources, fiction, nonfiction, theory fiction, speculative fiction, lots of fiction in a nutshell, but lots of critical nonfiction too. As Solomon mentioned, I have a background in anthropology, and I tend to take a pretty social sciences approach to my work, even as I'm stitching together and finding interconnections between seemingly disparate topics like technology and magic, or nature and technology, or artificial intelligence and the ecosystem. I like to think about these different themes as really interconnected in a sort of network that defines the present age that we're moving through, and hopefully with some rejigging can lead us towards better futures. I think for a lot of people in this room, I hope, they have a book that is like a portal to them. Maybe it's something that they encounter while they're studying, maybe it's a reference from a friend, maybe it's something they've discovered independently. For me, this book would be The Mushroom at the End of the World. I first stumbled upon this book actually in my final year of undergraduate studies as an anthropology student, a deeply disgruntled anthropology student, trying to make sense of how a discipline that is so ostensibly human-centric that it's literally named after anthropos could perhaps be broken open or make space for other forms of intelligence, non-human intelligence, plant intelligence, animal intelligence, alien intelligence. And I was also trying to make sense of a world that felt like it was already always on the precipice of falling apart. And potentially maybe there could be space for new non-anthropocentric, non-human-centric narratives to restructure our thinking of and relationship with the environment going forward. This book kind of did all of those things for me. It definitely made me much more optimistic in the future trajectory of anthropology. In this text, Anna Singh focuses on the cultural history of the matsutake mushroom, which is many things. But one of my particularly favorite framings of the mushroom is the fact that it thrives in areas of rampant deforestation. So it's kind of in these ragged edge zones of extreme capitalism, of extreme extraction, that the mushroom actually locates its life world and flourishes. So this is a theme that I've been working with across all of my work for the last few years now, which is basically trying to problematize and break down this binary between utopian and dystopian thinking. I like to think of those two terms, if we already use them at all, as more of a spectrum and less of a binary polar opposition. Thinking in that framework, I also draw a lot of my research and inspiration from the canon of speculative fiction. Speculative fiction is a term that often gets confused with science fiction, partially because the two sort of share an overlap of their genres. However, speculative fiction is more like social sciences approach to science fiction. And whereas science fiction can often be, or at least historically has been, an effort in future casting, one that seems to relish landing more in dystopian futures than utopian futures, speculative fiction looks both forwards and back in time. So speculative fiction is less like a predictive model and more a descriptive one. It's actually a quote by Ursula K. Le Guin, the author of The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. She describes speculative fiction as a technology in its own right, a capacity to extend and dilate the map of possible worlds that we can inhabit, a possibility of moving away from this myth of linear, progressive, universal progress that has kind of led us into many of the polycrises facing us in the present. So I carry these works and these worlds and ideas with me across my own work, and they continue to influence my practice as it evolves and multiplies across projects. The first project I want to introduce you to is Easy Crypto Build. This was a project I made kind of in the height of the pandemic, although it started a little earlier than that, kind of like November 2019 or so. I had just been on a press trip to the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, and it was actually my first time visiting Dubai as well. And I was really fascinated by a type of architecture that is endemic to a kind of future casting, I see at least, that attempts to merge technology and ecology, but it's an ecological perversion. It's a kind of simulated hypernature that is often more about symbolic gestures at an ecology or an environmentalism rather than realizing or inducing that vision itself. I guess a common terminology that people use to describe this kind of architecture is greenwashing. But moving beyond greenwashing, I was also interested in what I think of as a sort of neo-symbolic turn in architecture, and a type of architecture that seems to exist for a God's eye perspective. The Palm Jumeirah, an artificial palm tree-shaped island in Dubai, claims that it can be seen by satellites as if gesturing at a kind of exoplanetary or post-Earth perspective on architecture. Meanwhile, other quite cosmic structures like Apple campus's new headquarters in Cupertino attempts to cultivate a kind of hypernature inside its privatized dome-like structure. The landscape architect behind this project, Laurie Olin, has mentioned in pieces written about the project that the brief that he was given by Apple was to essentially recreate a primordial, pre-colonial ecology within the landscape. So Apple wanted trees planted that stemmed way back from California's natural environment prior to human colonization and settlement. There's a pretty crazy sort of hubris, like an almost Edenic desire to teleport back in time inside this cosmic ring-shaped structure, the landscape inside of which is, of course, privatized and available to Apple employees only. So the project Easy Crypto Build was looking at these structures. It was looking at the architects who made them. It was looking at the narratives and the language they were using to sell and talk about these works or worlds of architecture. And it was also looking at cryptocurrency and speculation and the promises and perils of the blockchain. And it was basically trying to draw a link between architecture as a business or enterprise to some extent of selling and singular idealized version of the future, a kind of guarantee that these projects would indisputably bring us towards a more environmentally just, a more architecturally elegant future world. The question, of course, is who exactly are these projects for, and what are they doing beyond the sort of symbolic but empty-shelled surface appeal? My solution to this, although I would say it was probably less of a solution and more of asking more and more questions, was to bring these narratives together through a speculative narrative of a hypothetical architectural sweepstakes set in the near future. This is at a time which wasn't so different from the time at which I was working, the pandemic, which saw an explosion in high-tech exit strategies, ways of escaping an apocalypse which seemed to have up until that point not hit the Western world in an obvious or overt way. And people were reeling from the conditions of an invisible virus, something that shut down global production timelines, air travel, even just going outside. All of that was suddenly off limits. And Naomi Klein talks about disaster capitalism as a sort of economic imperative for purchasing and accumulating and gathering in panic mode at the end of the world. And sure enough, we saw that happening in the pandemic when the sales of so-called billionaire bunkers hit their ultimate high. So I was curious about applying this narrative to a series of architecturally designed utopias. Speculative environments and structures, mostly seaborne, taking their inspiration from the ultra-libertarian seasteading movement, and inserting this kind of aesthetic into architectural sweepstakes. So in the project, a whole host of celebrity architects, from Thomas Heatherwick to Norman Foster, to even the resurrected ghost of Dame Zaha Hadid, were fighting it out in a design sweepstakes, which the rest of us could bid on by placing our bets on our favorite design proposition. All of these design propositions, from Nootropics, a floating palm tree-shaped floating island, to a startup incubator hub modeled on the Apple Ring, were basically references to architectural projects that already exist in the world as we know it. However, as the narrative makes clear, this is all a Fire Festival type scam. It's basically a Ponzi scheme in which the rest of us, the 99%, indulge in this fantasy, this belief that if we bid enough crypto capital on this design sweepstakes, and if we're lucky enough that the design entry we bid on ends up being the one that gets built, we'll, sure enough, have a place on this fully sustainable luxury architect-designed utopia. So I'm gonna play the trailer for the video and the company right now.
Imagine a world where you could live out on the open Pacific or the endless expanse of the Arabian Desert. A world of political and economic autonomy, of engineered and sustainable beauty. A world with opportunity around every corner. What if the mistakes of yesterday's cities could pave the way for future post-urban growth, deregulated and liberated from failed democratic systems, conceived by leading visionaries in the fields of architecture and design, intelligently engineered with your best self in mind? The wait is over. Introducing Easy Crypto Build. We've teamed up with the world's most powerful architects and the AI ghost of Zaha Hadid for the design competition of a lifetime. Place your bets on the winning Seastead prototype by investing in our premium Crypto Build cryptocurrency, or purchase a limited edition memorabilia coin of your favorite entry through our 100% secure blockchain network. Post-apocalyptic, sustainable luxury. Yours through Easy Crypto Build.
So, in addition to speculation and speculative fiction being a really handy tool to get us to think about alternative futures and forgotten pasts, speculation can also be very handy because of its adjacency to the present. So you can almost think of it formulaically, like taking elements of the world as you know it, as you see it, as it operates tweaking certain factors just a little, dialing it up slightly or down or turning it sideways to create that slight space of uncanny where it's not really sure, it's not 100% sure if this is fact or fiction. And that sort of in-between blurred space is certainly where I work. In projects such as Easy Crypto Build, it also occurred to me that for people watching the film outside of the architecture world, it wasn't always clear to them either if this was actually a pitch for a real company or a real investment opportunity, or if it was in fact a parody or satire. Depending on where I show the work, for instance, at one point I exhibited it at White Cube Gallery in London. And as you can imagine, for a sizable international blue chip gallery, their roster of patrons are the exact type of people who would probably want to indulge in a hyper-libertarian, paradise-themed exit strategy for the present. So I actually did get some serious inquiries, not to purchase the work, but to invest in real estate in this project, which was shocking, to say the least. The second project I'd like to talk about is similar but different. As you'll see in my work tonight, I have been moving somewhat away from parody as critique and moving more into a space of open-ended speculation. So my analysis and criticism of the architectural world, the industry, the language, the business of selling futures and how it operates has shifted slightly, but Swamp City is kind of a good middle ground between what I'm doing now and what I was doing with Easy Crypto Build. The project is set in the Florida Everglades, a sprawling ecosystem, incredibly biodiverse, incredibly resilient, yet reduced to 1/3 of its original size. The Everglades is a swampland, a wetland that used to cover around 2/3 of the state of Florida, and now it's protected around, what remains is around 1/3 of the state, and that's protected, but its future is definitely at risk. Originally, when I was thinking about making this project, I actually didn't have any plans to build a world inside of a game engine. I was actually planning to fly out to Florida and spend some time over there. This was in 2021, so still certainly pandemic high for sure in this second wave, I guess, summer of 2021, is what stopped me from being able to fly out there. So instead, I decided to reconstruct the narrative environment of the swamp inside of Unreal Engine, which is a game engine in which I work and build most of these worlds. The narrative is similar in a sense to EZK. It's situated in a near-future reality of severe climate disruption. And in the world of Swamp City, New York is underwater, LA is on fire, and in an unlikely turn of events, the Florida swampland has become the site for not just a new nature, but a new spin on selling nature. Developed by an opportunistic celebrity architect, Swamp City is an ecological smart city. It's a real estate development initiative that basically argues that in constructing a luxury retreat in which millionaires can take private biofuel-powered algae jets from New York and LA down to the swamp and spend a week or so luxuriating in the last sliver of pure nature known to humankind. Swamp City argues that in producing this kind of fantasy world of a pure nature, it's also helping to preserve the last slivers of the Florida Everglades that remain intact. The story is told by multiple characters, and it operates in a nonlinear timeline. You've seen the architect already. The second character is an alligator who is refusing to leave the swamp because the developers of the Swamp City project are basically trying to cleanse the Everglades of any sort of dangerous or risky non-human inhabitants that might compromise the pleasure of the human's luxury stay in nature. The final character is a complicated one, a bald cypress tree. Not just any bald cypress tree, but the oldest and largest bald cypress tree that existed on the North American continent. This tree, known as the Senator, was over 3,000 years old. It was burned down by accident in 2014 by a person who was trying to light up a crack pipe inside the park during the dry season in Florida. In the narrative of Swamp City, the bald cypress tree has been brought back to life by the scientists behind the ecological management of the park. The scientists were using artificial intelligence to reanimate and resurrect the tree. But as a way of exploring the question of intelligence, artificial or otherwise, and the question of whether an AI system understands time, understands identity, has a consciousness, the character of the bald cypress tree becomes a kind of cipher, a kind of ghost, a kind of monster that is simultaneously doing her duty in keeping this park up to scruff, making sure the air quality is perfect, that no one leaves a trace of carbon behind. But she also has these recurring nightmares, or visions really, of herself burning down over and over again. In addition to exploring the question of memory and time perhaps being processed in a nonlinear way by artificial intelligence, a kind of intelligence that we know so little about despite fancying ourselves as the creators of, the tree also acts as a kind of metaphor or protagonist or anti-protagonist even for ecological grief and how we understand the mutations and ghosts of a heating planet. I'm just going to show a short excerpt from the project.
But first, what are your intentions behind the project?
My intentions are quite simple, really. I want to bring people into a world of pure nature as an unfiltered encounter with one of the Earth's last surviving ecologies. I want them to witness the glacial pace of the river, to see the sun-dazed alligators basking beneath skeletal cypress trees, to feel the white heat of subtropical sun and the bone-heavy humidity, to breathe in the salty air of the mangrove tunnels, to experience the natural splendor of our planet before it's too late.
am the oldest living bald cypress tree. I am over 3,500 years old. And here they still think that when humanity dies, so does the swamp. Nine years ago, a girl crawled inside me to smoke meth, and everything caught fire, and I burnt out slowly from the inside. Slowly like molten lava. Slowly until my earth body caved. I can't believe I killed a tree that's older than Jesus, was all that she could say.
I'll say two quick things about this project before I move on to the next one. The first is the line uttered by the girl, some girl. I can't believe I killed a tree that's older than Jesus. That was actually a line that I found in the defense testimony of the woman who was brought to trial for burning down this tree. A lot of the time, I will take quotations, narrations, excerpts, elements of facts, and weave them into these worlds, expanding them, finding a strange poetry, perhaps, amidst all of the horror. That line really stuck with me, and I think it speaks volumes to the way that humans struggle so hard to conceptualize not just time, but ecological disaster and decay that spans beyond their own lifetime. And for me, the crazy thing is that the only way this woman could feel empathy for the ancient life she had taken away was by equating it to Jesus. It kind of sticks with me, for sure. The other thing I'd like to say briefly about this project, although it's probably nothing new if you've been paying attention, is that going back to what I was saying earlier about merging or blending or inhabiting this sticky space between present and near future, often when I world, I like to integrate recognizable buildings, architectural icons into these landscapes to really kind of promote or encourage that sense of strangeness. Of, is this real? Is this not real? I also didn't actually mention before why I use game engines, which is probably something I should address. For me, the kind of immediate drop-in quality of a game engine environment, the capacity to construct a world and just in the time span of 20, 30 seconds maybe of watching the video to just be dropped right into that narrative space. It happens so much faster than reading a novel, which can sometimes take paragraphs or pages or chapters to really settle into that world. Whereas the sort of multisensory environment of a game space, because of our familiarity with game engines and our increasing familiarity with real-time rendering, it just kind of creates an immediate tactic of immersion. So that's why I like to use them, for the most part. I'm going to talk now about a project I completed last year about Mars. For a while, I've been really interested in this question of accessing other planets, of this human impulse to not just explore the universe, but to claim it, to settle upon it, to colonize it. And I've been really suspicious of the kind of language that we use when we talk about space exploration. It's a heavily coded language. It's a heavily colonial language. And I think we have this real problem in speaking about our relationship to outer space with the language structures that we currently have. I think in order to develop a new framework, a new relationship for understanding outer space, essentially we're in need of a new language to do that, because the current language we have just doesn't suffice. So this project, titled The Martian Word for World is Mother, is an attempt at excavating or cultivating a new shared language, a non-human language too. But like any systems work, it's also looking at the kind of loaded history that we have with the red planet. I'm thinking about that in terms of economics and also legal legislation. In addition to our language being really backwards, our legislation is really backwards too. We currently don't have any international space law for protecting the environment on another planet. The only legal frameworks we have for even thinking about exploring other planets are treaties that were written 60 years ago now. The Outer Space Treaty, the Moon Treaty, and the Antarctic Treaty are the three frameworks that we use in thinking about what's legal and what's not legal on another planet like Mars. And although these frameworks are good in the sense that they say that no single person, entity, company, or country can claim ownership of this outer space real estate, it actually has a massive loophole, which is resource extraction. Currently, there is no legislation preventing the extraction of other resources from planets, asteroids, or other celestial bodies, and bringing them back to Earth and selling them through Earth markets. This is a loophole that many countries, including Luxembourg, the US, China, and I believe the UK too, have acknowledged and taken advantage of, pitching themselves as the interplanetary brokers for a multi-planet resource economy. So The Martian Word for World is Mother is a story of three worlds. It looks at familiar plans. Perhaps we've seen some of these in various media outlets over the years. Plans to build on the red planet. Plans that get around the legal loophole of not being able to alter the planet's surface too much by instead building a mega city for up to 1 million people, as Elon Musk would like to see by 2050, in the cliff face of Mars itself. So this entire human civilization would be underground, thereby making it legal, quote unquote, from an international space law perspective. The project also looks at the future of an interplanetary extractivist resource market. It's set at a time where the Earth has run out of clean air and drinking water. And in perhaps a very maximalist attempt to dial up the wild speculation that speculative fiction affords, in the story of this project, Mars has become a new resource for collecting clean water to send back to Earth and sell to the highest bidder. In this environment, the incredibly gigantic, almost cosmically so, Martian Grand Canyon, which is approximately 30 times wider and longer than the Grand Canyon on Earth, to give you an idea of its scale. This has been transformed into a water processing facility by a company called Praxis. So, amidst these two quite dystopian visions of a planet that has been colonized yet again by humans yet again, or extracted yet again by humans yet again, there's a third world in here too. This is the world of the landscape. This world imagines a Martian surface that is entirely populated by non-human species, an ecosystem, an intelligent one that has its own language system, a language maybe that humans don't understand, but just because we don't understand it doesn't mean it's not meaningful. In building this language, I was looking at a combination of dead and dying Earth languages, specifically Scottish Gaelic. Scotland has a very interesting relationship to Mars. When we think about planets, when we think about landscapes on Earth that maybe look like Mars or have some sort of similarity, we're probably thinking about deserts. We're probably thinking about the Martian training bases outside of Dubai, or the training camps also in China. We're thinking about dry, rocky, arid, red landscapes. And this is all an association that we get because of the imagery that we see of Mars. However, from a geologic perspective, Mars and Scotland are actually the most similar. So the Scottish Highlands specifically has a mineral composite in its soil which is almost identical to the topsoil on Mars. So in a kind of homage to that weird dualism, that weird twinning, speaking of which, also, Scotland has a twin. It's twinned its own city, Glenelg, with Glenelg on Mars. So there's that too. Honoring the Mars-Scotland connection, however weird it may be, and also thinking about real, yet speculative Martian languages on Earth, I made a new language, combining Scottish Gaelic and a Martian language spoken by a 19th century French mystic called Helen Smith. Helen Smith claimed that she could communicate with Martians, and what we could get from her diaries, and after a lot of study, the shapes and hieroglyphs on the left were turned into a Martian alphabet on the right. Interestingly enough, Scottish Gaelic and Helen Smith's Martian language also share the exact same number of characters in their alphabet, 18. Knowing this, I coded a text generator in Python, which fused Scottish Gaelic and Martian. To give this alien intelligence a voice, I combined both recordings that we've received so far of the sound of wind on Mars with the sound of wind in the Arctic as an homage to the current legislation that protects Mars from future human intervention, the Antarctic Treaty. I'm just going to play a little clip of this project so you can see the language in action.
The origins of this alien life in Utopia are ancient. As slow and symbiogenic as lichens growing on a tombstone. As molecular as Martian boulders scraped flat by millions of years of wind. Because of its relative unknowability, Mars is the perfect holobiont for mutated life to take shape. These new forms of life emerged from the long-lasting intimacy of strangers. Monsters are bodies tumbled into bodies. To storytell monstrosity requires stories tumbled into stories, for which no human language is well equipped. AI, like the Red Planet, is a cosmic overseer. It is a type of consciousness that is continually decomposing and reassembling itself. Like fungal colonies, it can die out in the middle, but can grow outwards from its edges forever. It's
Cool. That gives you an idea of how it looks. In addition to thinking about a new language system, a non-human language system that we could potentially adopt in order to understand and reframe our relationship with other planets, I'm also thinking about language in relationship to AI. And that was a huge influence behind this project. And because I was using an AI model to build this alien Martian language that you just saw, I was also very interested in thinking about how discussions around AI, certainly in 2022, but perhaps now more than ever before, are so often reduced to an anthropocentric understanding of artificial intelligence, what it is, what it's good for, who gets to use it, how it should operate. So frequently our conversations around AI center around a notion of fear that perhaps one day these models will become so advanced that they'll replace us. They'll make us obsolete, irrelevant. There's also all of these false binaries and questions that are being pressed upon AI and interrogated, such as, does AI have consciousness? Is it truly intelligent, or is it just a trick? A trick of the light, a trick of the language, an imitation at best. A few years ago, Nora Khan wrote an essay called Towards a Poetics of Artificial Superintelligence, How Symbolic Language Can Help Us Grasp the Nature and Power of What Is Coming. And this text to me was really instrumental, not just in thinking about the Mars project, but about my future collaborations and work with AI. In the text, Nora suggests several naturalistic or ecological metaphors for thinking about AI. She terms it a swarm, a hurricane, even an architect, actually, although that's not her favorite comparison point. My favorite is probably hurricane. I like the idea of thinking about AI as this kind of distributed collective intelligence, and also something that's permeable and shifting and ever-changing, and perhaps a space of possibility that opens up when we stop thinking about it in such a combative, humans versus AI type of way, and actually start thinking about it as a collaborator, an equal. We're short on time, so I'm just going to wrap up briefly with my latest project, which is called The Alluvials. The Alluvials is a project that I've been working on for the past 6 months while I've been out in Los Angeles, California. The Alluvials is inspired by the Los Angeles River specifically, but more generally, California's relationship to water. It looks from the perspective of again, quite near future, at the history of California's attempts to sustain itself, more specifically the city of Los Angeles's attempts to birth itself into the megacity we know of it as today, by essentially stealing water from other states, and in addition to taking water from everywhere from the Sierra Nevada mountains, up from the Colorado River and the Hoover Dam. It's also kind of done the unthinkable, which is channelizing its own river system, encasing it in 52 miles of concrete. Although today we think about LA as like a sun-bleached place, a super dry environment, an unforgiving environment. Historically, the LA floodplain was actually much closer to a kind of swamp or wetland. Of course, by channelizing its own river, done by the US Army Corps in the 1930s, the city of LA has fundamentally altered its own ecosystem. Currently, there is a master plan being developed by Frank Gehry to revitalize, quote unquote, parts of the LA River. Although because industry and real estate and a lot of speculative property investments have gone into maximizing and building upon as much of the city as possible, especially around the concreted river, it's realistically not possible to remove any of the concrete channel in this so-called revitalization project. So the plan instead is to insert some green spaces, some public parks, some bike paths, no doubt needed in the city of Los Angeles, but certainly not with the river itself in mind, which is made all the more tragic by plans for the city that could have been. 3 years before the US Army Corps descended on the city to channelize the river, an architecture practice, a landscape architecture practice, known as Olmsted Bartholomew, made a master plan for the city that was never realized. Rather than banishing the river below ground, this master plan was actually making the river the city's focal point. None of it would have been channelized if this plan was adopted. In working through a future vision of California's relationship to the water crisis, I wanted to look both forwards and backwards in time. So the narrative of the alluvials has a pretty nonlinear timeline, simultaneously set in a future in which all of the lakes, rivers, aqueducts, and water infrastructures that California has built for itself to accumulate and sustain its narrative of production, having, in this future narrative of the alluvials, that whole narrative of linear progressive progress kind of hits a dead end or a wall, and all of these resources California has built for itself die out. The Hoover Dam and Lake Mead, where California gets about 30% of the LA gets about 30% of its water from right now, is at a critical point. It's predicted to hit dead pool zone, which is a term that basically just means that the lake itself doesn't have enough water in it in order for gravity to power the aqueducts and send this water down to LA. It's predicted that this lake will hit dead pool zone in about 9 years from now, but it could actually be much sooner than that. This is actually a picture taken in Lake Mead a couple years back when the water levels hit their absolute lowest. And I think of water as quite an interesting exposer, perhaps, or a mechanism that's constantly flowing and refuses to be constricted by national borders, property lines. Basically, it's just this constantly flowing entity. And in flowing and fluctuating and shrinking and growing, it also is working through time as well and exposing all kinds of histories and artifacts that are now emerging from this dried up lake, like ghosts or monsters from the past coming back to haunt us. So yeah, the project looks both forwards and back. It looks at a future where water has been privatized and we've resorted to desalination strategies, which is actually California's probable next step as its natural resources for water in its own state and across state lines dry up. The state is currently prototyping different plants for extracting seawater from the Pacific and turning it into fresh drinking water for the city's population. This technology has actually been around for a while, but was written off about 10 years ago for being way too energy consuming and expensive. And I think it's pretty telling that we've now hit a point where we're once again looking at this technology. Ironically, technology that will just exacerbate the climate crisis and the water crisis despite offering a temporary stopgap solution. So in addition to this future casting, it's also looking backwards in time. It's looking at a time if the LA River was never channelized and the city itself could remain something more of a swampland. The project is narrated by a series of non-human protagonists, including P22, LA's celebrity mountain lion, who recently passed away earlier this year. In looking backwards in time, the project is using AI to combine historical images of LA, as well as historical plans for the city and its relationship to water that did not materialize, with future-looking plans for better or for worse. One of the end results of the project, which I'll share with you shortly, is a video made by Stable Diffusion, which is a text-to-image AI, which I trained on both historical and future speculative data. So I've been feeding the AI images from this project as these worlds inside of it are being built, as well as historical images of LA prior to the river's channelization. The effect is quite hallucinogenic. It looks kind of both forwards and back in time, and there's some interesting kind of poetic movements in how the AI identifies structures like rivers and structures like roads, kind of seeing them as one and the same at times. They slip and flow in and out of each other. And I do like the tension in the video itself. The imagery hinges constantly between the sense of dystopia and utopia as public paths are made over regenerated riverfronts, while the California Santa Monica mountains are on fire. There's kind of this duality or almost schizophrenia to the type of narrative that the video holds somehow together. And sometimes I think that that paradox can be really productive, because I think of speculation as not just a possible way of looking forward into the future, but also a way of taking stock of where we are now. So yeah, I'm just going to show a short clip, and then we can wrap up. That's it. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you, first of all, for a brilliant lecture. I'm really interested in the kind of the factors of time that you've introduced, and I guess specifically with this last project that is almost in the form of a time lapse. You've mentioned throughout the different kind of experiences of time from different actors within the narratives, and how humans have a really hard time perceiving other factors of time. For example, the scale of time of a tree is very different to that of a human. But at the same time, oftentimes it seems the projects are set in like a near distant future. I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit how you negotiate like reserving the project, the delivery of the project in the near future to something that is understandable at a human time, but also addressing the time scale of different non-human agents in the work?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and it's kind of an impossible question. But I also feel like, yeah, it's true with time, but I could also maybe dial that question out to the broader question of how to represent or introduce non-human intelligence from the perspective of the human. And that's something that I'd find AI to be a very handy collaborator. And increasingly, as I've worked with AI, not just in language, but in text and image generating models as well, my strategy has been, in a way, to slightly weird the context of what I'm working with by basically layering or stacking multiple approaches to AI. So like, for instance, I'll co-write a script with GPT-3 for like the Mars projects, and then I'll take whatever that script came out of and then plug that into the Martian language generator, which is effectively removing myself in 2 layers or through 2 AI models from the work. So my strategy for basically being able to open up a space for non-human intelligence or other understandings of time is to essentially use the AI models as a way of distancing myself slightly. It's almost like a slight letting go of control as well, and honoring and letting the narrative and the visuals of the work go where my collaborator, the AI, is taking them. So there's a slight letting go, I would say, in being like the primary author of these works or worlds, in the sense that they are built collaboratively with different AI tools or models or systems. But then the question of time is an interesting one too. And I think you're right to pick up on the fact that up until probably the alluvials, the work has mostly looked towards the future, like mostly inhabited that like in-between space of near future and the present. But yeah, with the alluvials, of course, I'm using the same technologies, I'm using the AI systems, but instead of just feeding these systems data or speculations on the future, I'm also introducing content and data from the past. So I didn't actually mention it in the presentation, but I'm also using a lot of historical pollution data from LA that's been gathered since the 1950s or so. And that will be, using an AI model, that will be translated into like both a soundtrack for the work and 3D assets that will appear in the game environment. And then, of course, with Swamp City, you have this character of the tree that's like existing technically in this hyper-architecturally engineered eco-utopian capitalist death drive selling point. But then she's almost this like interloper that fluctuates between past and future, in the sense that she has this kind of memory of herself like before she was burned down. And that memory, and in a way, like in a reference to this kind of idea of circle time, like we've been talking about quite a bit in the masterclass and also tonight here, her memory of her past. I don't want to spoil the film, but the kind of plot or the climax, let's say, of the story is when the kind of sharpness and the pain of that memory of her past kind of interlopes into the future and makes things very complicated for the park to continue operating. It's quite a dramatic ending, actually. But yeah, I think that's a great question, and thank you.
Hi. On a more, well, let's say practical note, let's say this whole thing of instrumentalizing this new upcoming, say, AI, but also just kind of looking at nature in general from a very kind of anthropocentric view. This is something, at least, that in these circles we've been relatively aware of and been thinking about it for a while. And this is at least something on the back of our minds for a while. But what I wanted to ask is that, like, how does this work perceived by, for instance, we're looking at the Florida or the LA projects, by local residents or people that are very foreign to this discourse in general? Because I'm trying to I look at this and it's so dear to us and it touches us so dearly, right? But at the end of the day, if you want to have some kind of influence, for better or for worse, we are not enough, are we, right? So I guess my question in a way is that, first of all, yeah, if you've had these experiences where people were just encountered this and were like, because you talked about how this is like small inversion, not inversion, but like subversion of these little things that create that uncanny. So how do people react to it in general? And also I was wondering, like, how can this potentially be a tool for collective hallucinations of, let's say, artists, but also the community as a kind of, I don't know how would this happen technically, but if you had multiple inputs from different agents, right? For the community members, for policymakers, for AI hallucination, and all of this would kind of become one, because right now I feel like there's so many people doing things, but it's at times a bit fragmented, right? I mean, I understand we're like different people have different visions, but I almost sometimes like want to see what this would look like as a kind of almost like hive intelligence kind of a thing.
Yeah. Or like an open source intelligence.
Or open source intelligence, yeah.
I mean, I would love to do that for the LA project. Currently, I'm working with Friends of the LA River, an organization that's been active in the LA region since the 1980s, I think, specifically to do with the kind of future possibilities of mending our relationship to that water system that flows through the city. And together with them, I'm hoping next time I'm back in town to do a kind of series of worlding workshops. The video that I showed you tonight is just like a small clip. I'm actually not entirely sure if it will even appear in the final projects, which will be both a video and a playable video game. But the plan is to do like a series of workshops with some of the FOLAR members, and they also have a great connection with like a lot of youth groups around the city, doing like nature tours of parts of the river that you're allowed to actually access, which are very minimal. And the idea would be to take the ideas generated from these workshops and then create another series of videos, like hallucinations, like the one that you just saw, but also to bring in some of these ideas into the playable game too. So that like wherever you're playing from, whether it's Delft or New York or LA, there will be a kind of moment for direct exposure and encounter with some ideas that are being seeded in the LA region itself. So that's the plan for that. The question about like how people engage or interact with the work from the area, that's an interesting one. With Swamp City, I did actually have a couple very weird encounters with a Miami real estate agent. two different agencies actually. One of which saw the project and thought it was a real initiative that was like trying to get seed funding and sent me an email like asking if they could come on board to like co-develop the project. The other one actually stemmed from a luxury real estate agent that accused me of stealing their idea for an eco-tourist retreat and like resort they have planned near Everglades City, which is kind of one of the few, I wouldn't say built up or definitely wouldn't say urban, but kind of like, it's basically like a small tourist town on the edge of the park where most people who go into the park for the day will stay. And it's a delightfully kind of low-key, quite scrappy infrastructure and environment. And yeah, I don't know if they were actually speaking with the folks, like some of the folks running the tours from Everglades City, but they said that they were like planning on kind of introducing a series of like luxury Airbnbs into the area that had some of the like eco-sustainability principles that Swamp City was talking about. So
yeah,
that was very strange.
You never know when the satire backfires, no?
Exactly. Well, yeah, I think that's also a really important thing too, is like, and like a lot of like sci-fi authors, like Stanley Chan, the author of The Waste Tide, you know, like he had a history in kind of consultancy in Silicon Valley before moving on to writing sci-fi. And he's always very vocal about this, of like, when criticism in an art or architecture sector is then taken as inspiration in a tech startup sector. Like it's this kind of snake eating its own tail where like the methods and modes of criticality and an attempt at sort of exposing the absurdity of a system then gets reabsorbed into the system because they don't think it's absurd, they think it's like $1 million idea.
Thank you.
I was wondering, how did the speculative fiction change since AI came to arise?
I think that's a really great question. And I think everyone in the AI space and not in the AI space is trying to work that one out. I would say, I didn't talk about this project tonight, but I have this ongoing collaborative writing project called New Mystics, which I started in 2021 after working with GPT-3 for around a year in beta phase. And compared to GPT 3.5, which is maybe some of you have experimented with, and GPT-4, which is the engine powering Chat GPT, GPT-3 is delightfully strange and unpredictable and uncontrollable. Like the ways in which you can't really determine or fine-tune so much the model to get such a precise output as you can with later engines and later editions of the technology. To me, operate more in the realm of like speculative fiction or speculation, just because there's less of a determinism to how this technology is being operated and used. And today, and I think increasingly into the future, as these models become more robust and more fine-tuned and more geared towards commercial use, there's a real kind of loss of something. I'm not sure how I could even define that thing. Like, I don't like using the word creativity again because it's like it's like anthropocentricizing the technology. Like calling it creative or not creative, like is to me a problematic way of framing it. But I would say that the more of a tightrope that human users have over those models, the less space there is for speculation, because the more they're just treated like tools or machines and less like a collaborator or something that comes in and messes up the parameters of the world you're working in a good way. And I mean, many of my projects have been thrown like wildly off course, from getting a really wacky output text and just being like, this is too good to not use. Like, I'm gonna just have to like reorient the map of this whole project. And I think being thrown off track a lot by this technology and by these models and by this way of thinking is, to me, what I think about when I think about like altered states of consciousness, and maybe how that can be accessed through AI. And I do worry about the future of it if it's becoming too literal and too controlled and too contained. I think it would be definitely giving up. It would be a loss, I think, for many more speculative practices.
Thank you.
Hello. I have one question related to the swamp city. And it seems like you have 3 different roles in this symmetry swamp. And one is architect and alligator and cypress tree. And they all have kind of a lines describe something. But for me, this lines seems not like it seems like not like dialogue. It seems more like a monologue. They just saying something and they don't have too much interact, if I understand correctly. So I wonder, is it you by different protagonists, you're trying to describe the same thing with different roles? I have this question because we watched the Lawrence video, I also have the same feeling because this figure or role, they seems like more autopilot mode. They are not really narrative, but they do have a real narrative. But narrative it's not based on the dialogue mode. It's more like a monologue, for my understanding.
I think that's a super interesting thing to pick up on. I think the excerpt of Swamp City is slightly misleading because it's what I showed you tonight was maybe around 4 minutes or so, and the whole film is around 30. And in different scenes in the film, there's certainly more interchange between the characters, or exchange, like dialogue-wise. Like the alligator and the architect especially have this kind of ongoing troubled relationship, let's say. But I think you're also right in the sense that these are 3 protagonists who are sort of offering us throughout the nonlinear narrative of the story their own takes and their own perspective on the same narrative system. So in terms of the actual kind of story progression or plot of Swamp City, it doesn't have much. It's more about the construction of a world, and then these 3 characters are almost these 3 different vantage points at which you begin to see by like cross-relating their own perspectives, like more and more layers to the system. So it's kind of like focusing on a static story from 3 different angles in order to get deeper and deeper into the narrative, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because for my understanding, this kind of a role, like based on your saying about non-human, and also try to decentralize to some kind of one way to understanding this world, or you can have multiple roles and characteristics inside.
Yeah, totally.
Hello. I have a question inspired by Nian's question, which is, I think, something that I'm struggling with having a non-human character is, what do you think is the difference between the voice of a human that's representing an alligator versus the voice of an alligator when you write the story?
Yeah, no, that's a tough one. And then you can kind of see how things changed a bit in between Swamp City and the Mars Project. Although the excerpt I showed you of the Mars Project was also a little bit of a misdirection because that project plays around a lot with this presence of the human voice and the legibility of the language system, the Martian text that you see. So in other scenes in the Mars projects, instead of having the human voiceover, you'll have the sound of wind. Sometimes that has English subtitles, and sometimes it doesn't. And then sometimes you'll have the sound of wind, so the spoken Martian language and the written Martian language. So nothing about the communication that's happening on the screen at that time is legible or makes sense to humans. So it's sort of playing around with these modes of transmission in language and when language itself becomes illegible from a human perspective. So in the Mars project, I was really trying to push that further than I had done in Swamp City, where I did have these non-human characters, but was using humans to narrate their voice.
Yeah, and then maybe my follow-up question is related to actually the Sino-futurism film by Lawrence Lick, and also with the Mars language, because I think there's a parallel that could be made about the idea of the other, the non-understandable other. Let it be another people who speak a language that you don't understand, or creatures on Mars. And that is also something that I'm struggling with when I was watching Lawrence Lick's films, and also maybe with the Mars film, is it seems like it's alienating, or it's trying to empathize with the creatures and the people who don't speak the language, but at the same time alienating in the sense that they're not understandable.
I mean, I kind of think of it as a gradation. So like throughout the whole dialogue in the Green Mars world, which is partially in the geodesic dome and then the rest of it in this 3D model of the Scottish Highlands, which I imported into the Mars level and then covered in plants and fungi. There's gradations, I think, of intelligibility. And I think that it's important, like, to think about ways in which language, especially non-human language and non-human intelligence, has a right of refusal. So, like, a right of refusal to be intelligible by human spectators. And I really like the idea of this story that's like a partial eclipse of language's function as a tool of communication. So, like, what happens when language kind of stops being understandable from our perspective? Like, can it open up a kind of affect, maybe, that isn't being processed linguistically, but it's more about how it sounds, how it looks on the screen? And I was actually quite inspired by a friend of mine who told me this anecdote of, like, way back in sort of medieval Europe, like when most of the population was illiterate, they would still go to church to listen to the sermon, and it was all like sung in Latin, so they couldn't understand it, they couldn't read it, they had no idea like what was being said, but like they would still go because they wanted to kind of get high on the sound of this like incomprehensible language, and I really liked that idea of like, yeah, like more generative forms of language being like less of a tool of communication and more of a kind of shared affect, I guess.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture, and thank you again for being here. I am wondering what the role of critique is in your work. Mm-hmm. So, and then how critique would well, I would say, in a traditional sense, you would say that critique is a speculative act.
Could you repeat the last?
So I would say that critique is always a speculative act, actually. So it is not, it is a positive act. It is unwrapping a set of established systems and then finding ways to discuss and subvert those. So, and I just find it curious that the word critique or critical, I don't think you actually used that once today. Yeah. And you know, I would actually call you a critic, you know, an artist and a critic, maybe not a writer, like, well, in the sense of, if you understand what I mean. Yeah, so I was just wondering if you could reflect a little bit on that, because sometimes, maybe just to get there, is also that line between overthinking and doing. Right? So, I mean, at some point there's always, and how maybe these kinds of tools that you're using and in a collective sense also allow one to overcome a kind of stasis or a kind of, let's say, writer's block or a creative block, right? So how one can kind of, move forward with a set of ideas and project them forward, while at the same time expanding one's thinking, but not getting stuck in one's thinking to take any kind of action in terms of a lack of production or lack of making or lack of doing.
That's an interesting idea of critique being a form of speculation. I guess I hadn't really thought about it like that before. But I would say that, like, the way that I describe my work and the way that I contextualize the 4 projects I spoke about tonight is that since 2020, like since Easy Crypto Build, the work has become less explicitly about criticism of existing systems, or at least less exclusively explicit about that critique, and wanting to propose alternative systems as well. And I mean, that also stems from, like, before I started making work, I was a critic. I was a writer, primarily. And I felt like I had kind of hit this brick wall at a certain point of just deconstructing and parsing apart the world as is, and really wanting to envision new worlds. And in basically moving into video work and focusing more on speculation, kind of trying to see a balance between criticism of the world as it exists and also, like, the potential to imagine other worlds too. And in terms of the tools, I think, yeah, like AI tools, of course, like people do speak of them as a way of breaking through writer's block, or like figuring out a way to kind of jumpstart a project. Like a lot of the times, friends of mine, like both AI artists and not, will just like either open up ChatGPT or Midjourney and just start like conjuring images just as a way to kind of like initiate a creative process. And I also kind of empathize with them and see it in the sense of like the output of these tools is never going to be the final product. Like it could be like a scaffolding or a foundation or just a way of getting started. But ultimately it kind of, I think, requires the hand of the human as much as it requires the hand of the machine. Like in order for like anything interesting, I think, to come out of it, there has to be this kind of back and forth, this like negotiation, this like conversation between these two frames of reference, because they fundamentally are very different in how they see the world, how they see information, how they move through it. And I would say that, for instance, with the Mars project, in using GPT-3 to co-write the script with me, there's something that GPT-3 and language AIs can do really well, which is to almost eradicate the disciplinary boundaries between certain information. So the way that the human brain is codified, the way it works, the way we understand the world and the information that we receive from it as we move through it is, of course, to like codify and like split knowledge into discrete disciplines and sections. And oftentimes, you know, we have this condition of a paradox or a conundrum where we're presented with two different kinds of information that like seemingly don't synthesize, or there's no way to bridge a gap between them. So we call that nonsense, or we call that something that's incomprehensible. Whereas with GPT-3, because it doesn't necessarily have this disciplinary binary type thinking, like in which all forms of knowledge are compartmentalized into different like drawers, I guess, like in our own minds, I was actually able to write the script for the Red Mars world, which is sort of a critique on plans to terraform Mars and to turn it into a planet B, and also plans like Elon Musk's Nuwa City, that like underground smart city on Mars. I fed GPT-3 both text releases from SpaceX, as well as texts on space anthropology and texts on ecological grief and mourning of a loss of landscape at the hands of human extractivism. And basically asked it to write a script for a very conflicted character that kind of believed in both of those worlds. And the result is a text that is a script that's quite schizophrenic. Like at times, the character is like harping on about this amazing techno-futurist solution to like escaping the Earth and surviving on another planet. But at other times, he has this like real grief and mourning for the loss of the landscape of Mars and the loss of its other futures for the planet that his own ego and willpower is eclipsing. And the way that the script kind of moves through and negotiates through that kind of logical divide, I mean, it's almost like schizophrenic. It's very hard, I think, like for me as a human author to kind of negotiate those two sets of information and create a script that combines them, just because the way that I delineate that text and that information is two completely opposite, binary, polar worldviews that just can't intersect. So I think, like, for instance, like using an AI language tool in that way to like overcome these binaries and these sort of self-imposed distinctions and impossibilities of interconnecting different visions of the future is a way that I like to use it, as a way of getting over my own like human bias or human logical trapdoors, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.